Well, good morning, everybody. We've reached 9 o'clock this morning, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to this Thursday, January 27th, 2022 session of VCE Ag Today. Today, we are joined by Horticultural Cropping Systems Extension Specialist Emmanuel Torres. He's going to be sharing some tips for starting off the vegetable season right. Before we get started this morning, just a few housekeeping notes. We're going to ask that everybody keep your microphones muted until the end of the session, until Emmanuel is done. We'll have a opportunity for everyone to ask their questions. Also, if you have any questions that you'd like to keep track of in the meantime, till we get to that opportunity, you can put those questions in the chat box and we will address those once we get to the end of the session. So once again, we thank everybody for joining us this morning. And with that, Emmanuel, if you'd like to share your screen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Trent. Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation. Hi, everybody. Let me see if I can work my screen really quick. So this should be coming in a second. Can you guys see my screen? Anyway.
Yes, sir. We got you.
Excellent. Let me see if I can also be. All right, I think I'm good. Oh, anyways, thank you again for the invitation and everybody for being part of this presentation. Again, my name is Emmanuel Torres. I'm assistant professor of horticultural sciences and extension specialist at the Eastern Shore Agricultural Research and Extension Center of Virginia Tech. And this morning, I like to split my presentation in two. The first part is gonna show a little bit of what we have been doing here at the Hort Lab on the Eastern Shore. I'm gonna introduce you to my team. So if you see any of them in the street, please say hi. And then we're going to talk about, like Trent mentioned, the beginning of the year. How can you start your production cycle in the best possible way? So with that, let's see if I can move on. So again, this is me. If you haven't seen me before, I had many hairstyles throughout the years. So it might be hard to identify me, but if you don't know me already, I did my master's and PhD at the University of Florida. Since I can remember, I've been working in production practices for vegetables and small fruits with emphasis in water management and fertilization management. Lately, have been putting efforts into precision agriculture technologies, mostly focusing on finding ways to make them more approachable for medium and small growers, finding ways to implement multispectral images, maybe drones, maybe sensors to medium-sized forms where we can find ways to make things more optimal, I want to say, in terms of the production, more efficient, but at the same time more cost efficient. On that note, the rest of my team, here they are. So far, right now we only are 4 here at the lab. Alexis, the one that you can see on your left side of the screen, he's a master's student. He's from the Dominican Republic, and he's going to be working on nutrient management and cultural practices in potatoes. Ricardo, on the other side of the screen, he is also a master's student, and he's going to be working with heat mitigation strategies for tomato production for both conventional and organic systems. And Joy, she's my technician. She is basically in charge of everything. So the way I describe it is like I'm the beauty and she's the brains of the lab. And with that, our priorities are 3 in terms of the main objectives of the lab. When I first arrived here, the first thing that we did was identify the main crops that are grown on the shore. Although my responsibilities are statewide, at the very first year, we put a lot of effort into working on developing research for the eastern shore, and now we're moving on towards the rest of the state. So on that, the first thing we did was focusing on traditional crops. Last year, 2021, we worked a lot with tomatoes and potatoes, and we are going to keep doing that on 2022 and the years to come. This coming season, we're going to be working a lot with irrigation management for vegetables. We're going to include cucurbits into the equation, and we're going to play a little bit also with cover crops. Altogether, we're probably going to have close to 10 different trials that hopefully are going to bring new insights in the way that we produce these vegetables. The second part of what we do, like I mentioned, is precision agriculture. The idea here is to implement, remote sensing to help identify potential issues there might be in the farm. I don't know if you can see the video that is supposed to be running on the right side, which is kind of glitching right now on my screen. I don't know why. But using a video like that or images like that, we can develop 3D models, like you can maybe see on the left side, that are going to help us identify potential trends of the crop, how fast it's growing, how the potential yield for this season might look like based on the number of flowers that we're perceiving, and can we see water and nutrient stress before our eyes can identify that. And that's something that we're going to be working on. Again, all this might sound fairly new and futuristic, but the idea that we have here at the lab is to find ways to make it as approachable as possible. And yes, we got to work with companies to make the technology a little bit cheaper, but more than that, we're going to find ways that you can really benefit from making the investment in this kind of technology. The third point that we're going to be working on is alternative crops, because sometimes the prices and the markets of what we call the traditional crops, they tend to fluctuate a lot. And it might be the case that you decide that one day you don't want to keep growing tomatoes. You want to shift to something new, different, so you can access niche markets. And we also want to help you with that. And the way we're seeing things, at least for the next couple of years, is we're going to focus our efforts on doing research in protected agriculture, high tunnels, mostly because of the accessibility for many growers to these kind of structures, which are the cheapest version that you can find so far. And also working with trying to develop production systems for Virginia for new crops. For example, green tea is an alternative that we have been trying to explore, given that the dynamics of diseases and pests that we might have for this plant might be different. I'm not saying there are going to be more or less pests. We just don't know yet. But we do know that there's a market, because most of the tea that we consume here in the States comes from either China or India or Japan. So we are bringing the plants. So there's definitely a market that we want to explore, and we're going to do that through research and trying to develop a production system for that. On that end, I wanted to show you a little bit of what we did last year in terms of alternative systems. For example, with the high tunnels, we tried to we identified, based on the system that we have for the open field, the high tunnels are a good alternative that might work really well for many growers. And let me explain why. When I got here last year, it was April, and something that the very first thing that I did was get as much weather data as I could. And here at the Eastern Shore AREC. Lucky enough, they have plenty of that. So I collected the average of the past 10 years in terms of temperature and rainfall and hours of light that we have every month. So if you look at on the right side of your screen, that graph right there that kind of looks confusing. It's actually plugging that information there. And I'm gonna talk about this a little more in depth in a second. But where I wanted to go with that, after I collected the data, I noticed that the weather patterns have been changing with the years, and especially rainfall. Lately, we have been perceiving more rain in the months of August and July. And I experienced that for the first time once I established a tomato crop last year here at the station. We had so much rain that most of the beds were already floated. After I saw that, I thought, well, if I'm struggling with this, I'm sure growers are too. So that justified in my head the efforts that we have been putting into researching production systems under high tunnels, because the advantages of using this technology, I listed 4 here in the presentation, but there are more that we can explore. But overall, if you have a protective structure on top of your crop, you might be able to extend the growing season. And again, this has a lot to do with the temperature that we are perceiving. If you notice here on the graph, we have rainfall on the Y side, and I'm talking about the lower end of the graph here. Hopefully you can see the mouse moving. But we got rainfall here, and we got temperature here. There are 3 key things you got to remember here. That's this middle line, dotted line right here, right in the 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That point right there represents the temperature at which most vegetables are going to stop growing because it's too cold for them. That doesn't mean that that the yield is going to be compromised. They will just stop growing, meaning that they will take longer to actually develop and mature. If you pay attention to the months here, you might see that here we have January, February, March, and then April past that dotted line right here. And that's kind of the reason why most of the seasons for vegetables here in Virginia start in the beginning of April. It's just because the temperature is right above that point where we can actually grow vegetables without an issue. Now, with that in mind, when I was saying that we can extend the growing season with the high tunnels, what I mean is that because you have a cover on top of the crop, you're basically heating up the air inside of the structure, meaning that you might be able to get into the market a little earlier, just because the air where you're growing things is a little warmer. So in the open field, yes, most growers will have to jump in maybe in April, but if you have a structure, and I'm not saying that you should yet, because we're still working on this, you might be able to get a little earlier into the ground, into the field, and therefore access the markets a little earlier. Also, if you manage well these structures, you might increase your yield and quality. It really depends on the system that you're working with. In some cases, you might reduce pesticides use and increase soil health, which overall is going to help you throughout time. But if you're not working with soil, because you might have diseases or rocky soils, or just be tough soils to work with, you have the option to work with soilless. It's a little more expensive, but it's going to allow you to produce where you usually want to. So before I keep going, I mentioned the temperature here, but I also wanted to mention the rainfall. Like I mentioned at the beginning, or at some point at the beginning, July and August were the months where we had more rainfall. And that's also something that you might be able to, you might be able not to deal with just because you have a roof on top of, your crop. So that's also a potential benefit that you might have with just having a roof on top of your plants. With that, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of the research that we have been doing. I promise it won't It won't be like too complicated. It's basically our first approach into developing a system that you can implement under a high tunnel. If you see this picture right here, this is actually the crop that we were growing, and we developed these structures based on the needs that we were trying to address. The first one being the protection against rainfall. That's why you don't see any plastic on the sides or on the front or the back. Although you might see this green pattern right here, this right here are cover crops that we planted, that's sun hemp. And the idea for that was to just protect the plants against heavy winds. But everything else is just a regular, production system for tomatoes. So we wanted to start developing this system for Virginia and be really careful about the details that we, the production practices that we recommended. So we thought, well, what will be the first thing that a grower might ask if they're jumping into, producing into a high tunnel? Well, we thought they're probably going to ask how many plants they can, have under the tunnel. I mean, how they can approach, how can they take advantage of every single square foot under the structure. So for that, we thought, well, let's try them to evaluate plant density, and we did. We evaluated we evaluated one single row of production and double rows of production of tomatoes, and we spaced those tomatoes both at 2 feet apart and 1.5 feet apart. So just to give you an idea, the 2 feet apart single row for tomatoes is the standard for open field, and that will give you about 4,300 plants per acre. We decided to, decrease the space between plants and still keep it in a single row. That will give us about 25% more plants per acre. We also tried at the same, distance between plants, but we doubled the number of rows per bed, and that increased the density by 50%. And then we went all the way to the stream and had a double row planted at 1.5 feet between plants, and that increased the density to 11,000 plants. So the idea was to understand if we can increase the density of plants that we have under the tunnel so we can maximize the potential yield that we might get there. And just to give you an idea, these are some pictures of how the crop looked like. We wanted to show that we didn't found, a lot of pest pressure or disease pressure. Those plants were looking fairly healthy. Throughout the trial, this is the single row and this is the double row. That's what I meant. In a single bed, we planted 2 rows of tomatoes, and they look dense right here, but that's what we evaluated to see if we have, an increment in yield. So what we found was that there was definitely competition there. If you put 2 rows of tomatoes compared to 1 row in terms of yield per plant, and keep this in mind, we're talking about the pounds that we got in 1 plant, not per acre yet. So if you had 2 rows instead of 1, you might see a decrease of almost 44% in your, yield per plant. And if you also increase the space between plants, meaning that you increase the number of plants that you might have per acre based on the in-row spacing, you might see a decrease of 34% compared to the standard recommendation for open field. At least when we're working with, yield per plant. And this had a lot to do with the number of fruits that we were getting per plants rather than the size of the fruits. Most fruits stayed the same size, basically because of the competition that we were having between plants. There were a lower number of fruits per plant, therefore that was probably due to a reduced number of flowers per plant. Pointing to a potential competition between plants. Like I said, the number of fruits was reduced by 45% compared to 1 row if you planted double rows. And if you decrease the space between plants, you might again reduce your potential fruit number by 31%. Now, again, at this point, I have only been talking about yield per plant. But we have to measure this in an acre basis, because again, if you have a structure, you're trying to maximize whatever you have under, that plastic roof right there. So once we transform this to an acre base, then we have to deal with the fact that each of these treatments represents a different density. So this yield per plant, I gotta multiply this for more plants than what I will do this particular yield, because you will have less plants per acre. Once we do that, we notice that there's no difference between putting your tomatoes in a single row, either at 1.5 feet between them or 2 feet between them, or having 2 rows, and still either of those won't increase the yield overall. Everything was the same. And that's in terms of fruit number right here. You can see the fruit yield was still the same. We have about, in average, close to 25 tons of tomatoes per acre. And all the treatments were performing the same. So to this point, it might look, well, then the traditional way we plant tomatoes in the field might be the way to go. And that's good, because if I would like to convince or try to drive a grower towards using high tunnels, now I can say, if you establish a high tunnel, you don't really have to change your plant density from what you're used to in the open field, because that won't change the result that you're going to have under the tunnel, meaning that the transition is going to be a little simpler for that grower. Now, that does not mean that there's no benefits to using the high tunnel. Before I get to that, we wanted to identify if there was no difference and there was competition between treatments. What was the competition that was happening? Was it because of water? Was it because of light? Was it because of nutrients? And on the particular example of light competition, to identify that, we measure the plant height, because plants, once they are competing for light, then they tend to elongate their stem, meaning that if a particular treatment that we tested was a little taller than the others and there was no yield difference, that will mean that that treatment was competing for light. So we measure plant height at 4, 8, and 12 weeks, and we did not find any difference among treatments. And that basically means the light was not the issue. Here, at least in the Eastern Shore where we tried this, radiation was not a problem. So could it be nutrients? Could it be water? We don't know yet. We're going to repeat that this season. But the good thing here is that we can actually play around with water and nutrients. I cannot increase the amount of light that we get here where we at, but I can definitely put more water or more nutrients. So then there might still be a way to increase yield under the tunnels, as long as we find the right amount of water and nutrients that might allow a higher density of plants to increase yield. So that's something that we're going to pursue in the next coming years. The last question here is, okay, you got all that data for high tunnels, but is it better than open field? And we also tried to measure that. So the other thing that we did was we took the same variety, planted at the standard density, which is 2 feet between rows and in a single row of planting. We plant everything at the same time, and we measure yield both in open field and in the high tunnel. And what we found was that if you're working on a high tunnel, you might see an increment of about 35% on your yield compared to open field, which again is good. That 35% there should be, we hope, because we still need to do the numbers, but should be a way for you to pay for the structure and still get benefits out of the system that you're using. Now, again, we're gonna run the numbers on this. We're gonna keep working on this for the next upcoming years. But the key point to remember here is that at the end of this study, high tunnels performed better in terms of yield, and that was because of the protection that we were providing to the plants. Just so you have an idea, on the open field during the season that we have, we perceived close to 16 inches of water. And of course, on the high tunnel, that was 0. So that difference right there allows us to have higher number of higher number of flowers, therefore higher number of fruits with better quality. And that's that 35% increment in yield that you see there. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about potential, recommendations for you to start your year right. Now you know what we do here at the Hort Lab. in the Eastern Shore. If you want to come, call, email us, please do. We are more than happy to help you in anything that we can. And now that we're beginning the year, I know it's time to get prepared, to put everything in perspective of how your system is going to look this season, what are you going to try to produce, and how much you're going to try to generate for that. So for that, the first thing that I can say is that soil testing is your friend. The recommendation for soil testing usually goes for the fall season, but if you didn't do your soil testing for whatever reason last year, please do before you start your season. It's always good to understand what is happening with yours, with the balance of nutrients that you have in your system, or your potential soil or soilless media that you're going to use. If you don't know the texture of the soil that you have, it's always great to measure that. Understanding the texture of the soil is going to help you, at least to some extent, to understand how the water will move in your soil. And I'm sure that all the extension agents will be happy to help you with that, and we will be there to support them. But understanding those things, key things, the nutrient balance, the pH of your soil and water, and your texture of the soil, that's going to help you make decisions across the year. They are going to better your system in terms of how much inputs you're putting and what results you get in terms of yield. So key thing here, make sure that your sample is collected the right way. There are plenty of data out there and publications that are going to show you how to take your soil sample. A few key things here to remember. Make sure that your sample is not too wet, because if you have a field, you basically want to take different samples across that field, and you want to mix them all together so you can send them to the lab. And if it is too wet, you won't be able to mix together, the soil samples so you can send it. So just make sure that you pick the right day to take that sample and to send it. The way you want to do this is divide your farm into fields from which you're going to take samples, and then you're going to send that depending on the sloping on the field, how close to the water is, and things like that. That may, like if you have big differences in the way your field is shaped, or water and nutrients are distributed, you might want to take more than one sample to send, so that way you understand what is happening there. If you want to know more about how to take soil sampling and where to send it, here I let you a link to the publication soil sampling instructions for the farm. There are others out there, but it's better for you to just pick one of those and start with a recommendation, and then trying to do it yourself just based on whatever you think is right. Just follow the recommendations. That will help you have the best potential result. When you take your sample, make sure that you take at least 16 or 20 samples. You can do it on a zigzag pattern on your field. That's going to help you have a better representation of what is happening there. Make sure you mix everything in a clean bucket or plastic plate, and fill out your sample information sheet, put all the information there that is required, and send it to the lab. And it's fairly simple. It won't take you more than a morning, unless you got hundreds of acres, and you're gonna get plenty of benefits out of that sample. Second thing to remember here, and I'm not gonna take much longer here, but second thing to remember, you took your samples into the lab. Make a plan now. The season is coming, and you need to be prepared. Don't think only about what you're going to grow, or rather think about the details of how you're going to grow this. So you need to make a plan, and yes, that includes water and fertilizer. And I'll give you an example of the 6 things that I tend to, try to keep in mind for the growers. Variety selection, how you're going to produce your transplants, if you're using transplants, the calendar of cultural practices, water, fertilizer, harvest, and commercialization. And I'll give you examples for each of them. So for example, if you're gonna select a variety, let's say that you're gonna work with tomatoes, you need to select a potential a variety based on the potential yield you're going to get, the disease and insect resistance that that variety might or might not have, the environmental resistance. When I say environmental, I mean, is it resistant to high temperatures? Does it have history of surviving on fields that have been flooded? Is it, water flooding resistant? Because there are varieties that have been developed for conditions that might be more, similar to your particular field. So understanding that, and I understand that most of this comes from a combination of experience and literature. So try to use both. Identify a variety that is really adapted to your field, that has great yield, at least for what you are looking for. Like great yield for me might be different than great yield for you. And make sure that you pick in a variety that is going to help you reduce the amount of pesticides that you use to control diseases and insects. That's the first barrier of protection that you're gonna have, your variety selection. So just make sure that the one you pick is right. In some instances, you can mix varieties, which can also help you to certain extent defend against some pests. But I will leave that to the entomology specialists and the plant pathologists, so they can refer you on that end. Let's imagine that now you selected your variety based on literature and your experience. Are you going to produce transplants? And if you do, then you need to make a plan for that. First, key thing here is sanitation for your plant production area. That is key, and that includes where you're going to fill your trays, where you're going to put the the seeds on the soils, where you're going to keep the seeds after you plant them on the tray, and what kind of management you're going to have for those seedlings. So temperature and light management is key here. And if you have done transplants before, you probably understand that depending on the temperature, the speed of growing of those transplants is going to change. And also the light that they perceive is going to play a role on how they're going to develop. You got to make sure that you have a good selection of growing media. Try not to reuse growing media, and if you do, try to find a way to clean that growing media as much as you can. There are different ways that you can do that. Try to keep your containers that you're going to use, meaning the trays or the pots, as clean as possible, and identify what kind of watering system and management you're going to have for your seedlings. Are you going to use liquid fertilizer? Are you going to use a mix of dry fertilizer mixed with the growing media so you can feed your plants? You got to keep in mind all this so you don't get to a point where you need to feed your plant and you don't have a way to do it. And then think about hardening. Are you going to harden your plants? Because that usually helps to reduce the stress of moving from where the seedlings are growing to the actual open field or high tunnel if you are working with it. Assuming that you get to the point where you're going to have your seedlings or seeds at the field, you need a calendar for the cultural practice. Are you going to use plastic mulch? What kind of mulch are you going to use? What color mulch, which is also influenced by the temperature that you have near your planting date. If it is too hot, maybe white mulch might be better than black mulch because it's going to reduce the temperature around the soil. What kind of fertilization and irrigation plan you're going to use? Are you going to do some kind of soil conditioning? Are you including organic matter into the soil just to, help the soil loose up? Or are you plowing? Are you making beds? Try to make a plan and try to go, on your plan, try to think ahead for what kind of potential issues you might have. Yes, rainfall might be an issue. Is the tractor working well? Do I have all the implements that I need if I'm working with a tractor? Am I using a high tunnel? Is the plastic of my high tunnel being there for more than a few years and it's already dirt? Do I need to clean it? You gotta do that before you have your plants in, so the plants don't have the less stress possible, so you can get the best yield you can. Am I stacking and preparing my trellis system? How am I pollinating? Am I doing it with bumblebees? Am I just letting bees and insects take their course? and how am I combining my pest and disease management with the fact that I need pollinators in my system. So try to get as much information as you can about the pests and the potential pollinators. Talk to your extension agent, to the entomology specialists and the plant pathologists. They're going to help you out to create a balanced plan that is going to allow you to keep your crop clean without necessarily, affecting your pollinators, which most of the pollination will come from insects, although, water and wind play a big role here. When it comes to water and fertilization management, that's key right there. How are you irrigating? How are you deciding how much water are you putting every day or every 2 days or every week? Are you using evapotranspiration? Meaning, are you taking data from the websites about your particular region and say, well, given that January has historic evapotranspiration of 5 millimeters, and I'm going to use that as a reference? Or are you just irrigating based on experience? Can you improve on that? Can you get more data and have a better understanding of how much water are you using and how that is interacting with your fertilization plan? Many times you will fertilize, and because of the fact that you're putting a lot of water combined with the already rainfall that is going to happen, you might be leaching fertilizer, meaning that you're losing money because fertilizer at the end of the day is money. So keep that in mind. What kind of irrigation system do you have? How efficient is the system? Do you have leaks? Are you going to use soil sensors? Right now, the technology for soil sensors is being improving a lot. They have become way cheaper than before and more accessible, and they will give you tons of data. And you will have an idea of how to minimize your losses and maximize your profits there. Are you using macronutrients and micronutrients, which again, your plan is going to be based on your soil tests, which I mentioned at the beginning. Are you using soilless media? Are you using dry, soluble, or liquid fertilizer? All that should play a role. And whenever you are working with your soil, with your fertilization plan, there's something we call there's a principle that we call the 4 R's. 4 R's come from the word right, and what it means is the right rate, as you can see here, the right timing, the right placement, and the right source. There's plenty of literature out there about this, but again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate on reaching out. Then we got to the harvest, and when it comes to the harvest, it's like, okay, when I am, harvesting in terms of the year, can I estimate that, and what kind of conditions am I going to store those products? Am I going to have some sort of post-harvest management? What are my, agriculture? What is my storage condition? What kind of good agricultural practices do I have, and how much in how am I going to sell? My products. What am I selling? Am I retailing? Am I just selling on my farm? And do I have a contract? It's always good to have an idea of all this, and it sounds like a lot, but once you put all this together, you actually have a plan. And if you have a plan, you're probably going to minimize the potential issues that you might have in your season, because you can always change this. I mean, once you do it, you don't have to necessarily follow it step by step without changing anything. You might modify it, but at least there is a plan. And if somebody asks you what you're going to do next, you have an idea. You are not reacting. You are actually prepared to, for what it might happen or not, because you already thought about most of the things that might happen or not. And I know, most of you have plenty of experience. I know that you can probably do this in one sit, but I truly recommend having a plan for the season for different species that you might grow. And I think that's the best approach that you can have to the start of the year. So with that, again, my name is Emmanuel Torres, and if there's any questions that I can answer, I'll be more than happy to do it.
Well, thank you so much for being with us this morning, Emmanuel, and thank you for all your comments. Very insightful. We certainly appreciate that. At this point, we are going to open up the discussion for questions. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, the mute button is down there in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. At least it is on my screen. It might be a little bit different for you. But if you'd like to ask a question, you can either unmute yourself there and ask it live, or if you'd like, you can also type questions into the chat box and we can answer them from there. I do see in the chat box where Stephanie posted a link to a soil sampling publication from Virginia Cooperative Extension. Emmanuel touched a little bit on that earlier in his discussion. If you'd like to check that out, that link is down there in the chat box. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds here in case somebody's typing in the chat box. Emmanuel, we got a question here in the chat. Can you share which varieties of tomatoes you grew?
Yes, thank you, Tony. Well, let me get you the name right here. The variety that we tested was called CR9941. That one is still in code, but that being said, there's a lot of information out there of good varieties. This season, we're actually going to try to do a variety trial, which again, hopefully is going to give you some insight on potential varieties to pick. So I hope I can give you more info about that next year.
All right, thank you. We've got another question in the chat box. Let's see. Can you discuss the growing of green tea in high tunnels further? Do you offer tours to potential growers?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So at this point, we do have green tea here at the station. The plants are still small. And we're gonna try to grow them in the open field first. And probably later, we're gonna try it on their high tunnels. Yes, the station also is open to any grower that wants to come and check out what we have. We're more than happy to show you around and show you the plants and how we are growing them. Hopefully in one of the upcoming field days that we have here at the station, we might be able to share more information about that. But so far, our plants are still fairly small. I'll say they're probably less than 12 inches high. Green tea takes fairly long to grow, and we're gonna start. We're trying to partner up with different universities too, so we can develop systems that can be applied to either Florida, to either Virginia, and in other states at the same time, because the temperature difference between the regions where we're growing is going to play a role, especially in green tea. Not so much on the way the plant grows, but rather on the quality of the leaves that we get, which at the end of the day is kind of what you want to target here. So again, great question, and I really hope I can get you more info about that in the upcoming, years, because it's just that the plant takes a really long time to grow.
Emmanuel, how long does it take for a green tea plant to reach maturity?
First harvest is usually estimated at the end of the second year, but that first harvest is really small. Okay. And when I say harvest, what you actually harvesting is, the apical meristem, the top leaves. Mm-hmm. So you basically come with a with some sort of pruning equipment, and you just prune those top leaves, and that's what you collect, right? The first one is not too big because the plant is still fairly small and it's developing. And after the third year, then you start getting nice harvest, and the green tea can last for many years. So it's not like you're going to harvest for 5 years and that's it. You're probably going to have it for more than 10 years. So it's an investment, but it's definitely something that we want to explore in terms of the market, in terms of how many harvests can we get here in Virginia, because usually, for example, in Japan, they do 2 harvests, the first one being the best in quality, the second one being the one that they use to do iced tea, things like that. So depending on the harvest, the year, and the temperature, you're going to have a niche market for really, really good tea. And then for the rest of tea market that you might find out there, iced tea, tea in bags, things like that. So think about tea as you will think about wine. You're really looking for good quality on the leaves, and it takes time.
Okay, thank you. Got a few more questions in the chat box, looking like we're generating a little bit of discussion here. So that's great. What is your view on high density spacing, 8-inch in particular, with proper pruning?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm assuming that those are 8 inches. They're referring to tomatoes, because that's what we talk about, because it's really species dependent. If it is, for tomatoes, proper pruning might play a role in how the plants will respond. What I will say though is that if you prune tomatoes, you're spending money, because at the end of the day, you kind of have to pay for the harvest. And even if you do it yourself, you're gonna think that you could be doing something else to improve your system. So the way I tend to think about this is an assisting approach. If you have high density, you're putting more plants. If those plants do not increment your benefits, your profits, then you probably want to go with a lower density where you have less investment in seeds. And unless the pruning is really increasing the quality of the fruits that you're getting, I wouldn't necessarily go with that, because again, you also have to pay for the labor, and even if you're not paying, you are labor and it's your time, and you might be, you could maybe use that time to find new markets, find new potential buyers. So I really like to think about this as a system. So I'm not saying it won't work. I don't want you to think that that's what I mean. I'm just saying that it really needs to be put in perspective against how much benefit am I getting for having a higher density and doing that pruning.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we got one last question here in the chat box. For soilless growing, such as grow bags, what is your preferred growing medium? Compost only or other?
Thank you for the question. For growing medias, I tend to the way I think about growing medias is why do I need growing medias? That's the first thing I try to ask myself. And I only do growing medias if my soil is not adequate for growing, and that usually has a lot to do with density, disease pressure on the soil disease. So if that is the case, then my second question to myself will be, what is the cheapest growing media that can give me the best potential results? At least in the US, there are many growing medias out there. Compost is one, coconut coir is one, potty mix, that what we call potty mix, which is, it's usually coming from a mix of what they pull from the underground on lakes in Canada and northern regions of the States. And the last one is usually pine bark. being pine bark the cheapest one because, you know, we've got a lot of pine trees. Some people like to stay away from pine bark because of the high part, the big particle size, which they don't tend to retain a lot of water, and sometimes it can be a little bit acidic, the growing media. But that being said, to me, the best approach to a growing media is that the one that gives the more benefits for the less money. So if I can do something like a mix between fine bark, which again is fairly cheap, with compost, then I'm working with a media that can sustain my plant, because at the end of the day, the media needs to provide support to the plant and retain water and nutrients. So if the pine bark can help with the support, while the compost can hold on to the water and nutrients, then I got a nice system. Because if I go, you know, 100% compost, I might find that it's a little more expensive. I might find that it might retain a lot of water, and then I'm on the other side of the spectrum where I'm dealing with, you know, a situation where plants don't have enough oxygen on the roots. And also because there's so much water, I might have to deal with, you know, issues with the pH, issues with low retention of nutrients, because, you know, the water eventually is going to leach. So I don't think there is a clear answer to this. I like to go with mixes. Mixes, they tend to give you good results. Something that we evaluated a few years ago was a mix between potting mix and pine bark that works pretty well, 50-50. And I believe you can do the same with compost and pine bark. They should minimize, you know, reduce a little bit of your investment and still give you good results. Now, keep in mind that the container that you use also plays a role. Like you mentioned, bags are gonna probably hold more water than, you know, pots. If you use pots, sometimes growers use boxes. Of all of those, the bags are gonna hold more water. So with that, you know, it's something that we can definitely explore to try to increase the percentage of pine bark and reduce a little bit of the compost, and that way you still get the retention of water and nutrients, but again, reducing your investment. Because at the end of the day, I always try to keep in mind that, you know, growers want to get their profits. That's usually how it works. So it's always good to reduce your investment for that. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you for the explanation, Emmanuel. It looks like we've reached the end of the questions that we have in our chat box. I'll give it a few more moments here if anybody has any last questions to ask here, or you can unmute yourself and ask them live, but we'll just give it a couple seconds. All right, well, it looks like we've covered everything. Emmanuel, we'd like to thank you again for joining us this morning. Great information you shared. I think that'll certainly be helpful for everybody who watches this both live this morning as well as the recordings down the road. We'd also like to thank everybody, all of our participants, for joining today. If you're new to VCE Ag today, this program is being offered on a bi-weekly basis. So our next opportunity to join in will be February 10th, where we'll be joined by NC State Extension Specialist, Dr. Matt Poore. He's going to be covering interpreting forage analysis reports. So a lot of times when you send off these forage samples, you get a report back with the analysis. There's a lot of information on there. Matt's going to be going through that information and telling us how it relates to the quality of the forage itself. So you can join us on February 10th if you're interested in that. I'd also like to recognize everyone, all the ag agents who make this program possible. There's Stephanie Romelchek, Laura Maxine, Frank Long, and Robbie Longest. I mentioned earlier, all of our recordings or all of our VCE Ag Today programs are offered as recordings. You can access those on our YouTube page. You can follow us there, and you can also follow us on Facebook at VCE Ag Today. All of the recordings are available there as well. Finally, if you look on the screen, there's a scrolling QR code as well as a link to a evaluation that we've compiled. That's helpful to us because we're able to glean information that y'all are interested in learning more about. And that's, we pull a lot of our topics for these VCE Ag Today programs from there. I'm also scrolling on the screen are the upcoming vegetable meetings in Virginia. I'll let it scroll back through there so we can read those all for anybody interested in attending. So there's our evaluation link. Please take an opportunity to fill that out if you haven't before. And then these are our upcoming extension fruit and vegetable meetings. The Suffolk Southeast Virginia meeting on January 28th, Hillsville January 29th, Mecklenburg February 16th, and Northern Virginia and Loudoun on February 21st. And you can see all that contact information there if you'd like to register for those. Oh, and we got a few more here. So Richmond area on February 22nd, Standardsville, Charlottesville area on Feb 23rd, Shenandoah Valley on February 24th, Virginia Beach Mid-Atlantic Strawberry Program, February 28th through March 1st, Winchester, Madison, Coast Central, Virginia, Roanoke, Carroll County Fruit Schools will be the week of March 21st. So you can see that contact information as well. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Again, Emmanuel, thank you for being with us today. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. We wish everybody a great Thursday, and we look forward to seeing you soon.